This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. After a lost decade, growth in parts of Latin America seems to finally be improving. On today's episode, former Colombian Finance Minister Mauricio Cárdenas joins us with an overview of the region's strengths and weaknesses.
For every global crisis that there is, Latin America has, I'd say, the entire answer, but part of the answer, part of the solution.
It always feels risky to take an optimistic view of Latin America. There are so many challenges. The world is volatile, as this tragic new war in the Middle East shows us. And yet, at America's Quarterly, we decided to take the plunge anyway and publish a new issue entitled A Relatively Bullish Case for Latin America. You can find it on our website. That's americasquarterly.org. But the central idea is that some countries in the region, especially Mexico and Brazil, appear to have kicked into a higher gear of growth. Both those countries should see an expansion of more than 3% this year, according to the IMF. Elsewhere, the outlook is more complex, but the opportunities remain largely the same. Nearshoring, agribusiness, the needs associated with the energy transition, and more could, and maybe even should, allow Latin America to grow a bit faster in the next few years than the region did during the lost decade of the 2010s. Today on the podcast, we've invited our friend Mauricio Cárdenas, the former finance minister of Colombia, with an O, from 2012 to 2018, and currently a professor at Columbia University, that's with a U, where he also conducts research on energy and climate policy. Mauricio is, I'm certain, going to challenge me a bit on this glass half full view of the region. He's part of an institution called the Group of 30 that recently published a report on the region's persistently low productivity. So, we're going to talk it out. Mauricio, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure, Brian.
Mauricio, I recently wrote an article for AQ called A Relatively Bullish Case for Latin America. You were part of a group of authors who published a report entitled, Why Does Latin America Underperform? Which one of us is right?
I think both. I am of the view that Latin America, despite these multiple crises, the polycrisis and the confluence of calamities, is in a good spot, relatively speaking. So in that sense, I agree with your idea that, these are times of opportunity and Latin America could be seen as a region with the half full glass. But on the other hand, the politics in Latin America have not changed. So that maybe this is another opportunity that we'll let go. And that's the reason for the pessimism of the G30 piece.
But to stay on the cautiously optimistic side for a moment, the IMF recently released its growth forecasts for Latin America and the rest of the world for this year and next. And for now, the third straight year, they had to increase their forecast for Latin America by a substantial margin after the original projection proved too bearish, too pessimistic. The IMF now expects 2.3% growth for this year and next, led by Brazil and Mexico, which are both expected now to grow above 3% in 2023. Those are not spectacular numbers, but they are better by a clear margin than the region was averaging in the 5 years prior to the pandemic, when we saw growth just under 1% a year. Is this, in your mind, is this any motive for celebration? I know it could be better, but for a region that it really has been going sideways for 10 years now, even 2.5% growth feels pretty good. Don't you agree?
Not necessarily, because 2.3% is still very mediocre. It's not a growth rate that will allow Latin America to solve any of its problems. Poverty being, I guess, the most important one. but also issues related to unemployment. I mean, unemployment is going to continue to increase with this pace of economic growth because not enough jobs are going to be generated. So, yes, I mean, relative to the previous forecasts, these are better numbers, but these are not numbers to celebrate, especially because the world economy is going to be growing slightly faster. I mean, this is going to be still one of the lowest growing regions in the world. I mean, the world is going to grow at about 3%. So the region, Latin America, is going to be below the world's average. So my sense is, we still have a very serious problem. And the discussion should be how to improve these numbers.
Well, and the report that you wrote with the G30, as you mentioned, perhaps it takes a longer view than I do in my piece. The G30 report notes that since the 1970s, Latin America has grown on average about half as fast as a peer group of comparable countries, including East Asian countries. If we take the long view, what are the primary reasons for that in your mind?
The main kind of like explanations, to go back to your question, are related to the fact that this is a region that underperforms very significantly in terms of something that is very hard to measure, very hard to define, but yet very important, which is productivity. It's not so much an issue of not having made enough progress in terms of infrastructure or not having made enough progress in terms of schooling. Yes, Latin Americans, in a very significant way have improved their education, but yet we have not been able to tackle the issue of productivity. Our productivity does not grow fast enough. And that's really what drives the difference between Latin America and other regions of the world, especially Asia.
These are big topics we're touching, Mauricio, but again, in a nutshell, if you were to boil down that productivity challenge to a couple of sentences, what would you land on?
I may be biased a bit on this because of my Colombian background and origin, but this applies to many, many countries and a growing number of countries. Security issues are really important. I mean, safety conditions, crime. If you just compare the crime indicators of Latin America with any other region of the world, you see, well, there is a problem. There is a significant problem. Latin America it's the 8% region, 8% of global GDP, 8% of the world population, 8% of carbon emissions. So when you are on the average 8%, you say, well, we don't have a special problem. But in crimes, homicides in the world, Latin America is 25%. So that means, that there is a problem. And I think there is a link between security conditions, crime, and productivity. A lot of resources in the region get diverted, not to say wasted, to protect ourselves, to protect firms, to protect individuals. And that's basically an erosion of productivity. So that's number one issue in my view. And the number two issue on productivity, I think, has to do with the fact that the region, it's still, the word that I say describes Latin America the best is informality. So this is a word that is not kind of like common, it's not regularly used, but informality means that either individuals or firms are not paying taxes or not paying social security contributions or do not have the protection of the labor code or do not comply with certain standards in terms of production, etc., etc. Informality is also a very specific issue in Latin America, and that results in low productivity. And you could ask me why informality breeds low productivity, and it's because informality has resulted in very small firms, very small businesses, 1, 2, 3 individuals per firm that do not grow and that are very inefficient. Safety or security, informality, and low productivity. And I think that's the triangle that causes most of the maladies in Latin America.
Well, and it's interesting, Mauricio, because, in my lifetime, I feel like we've seen so much progress in the region on a variety of fronts. We've seen extreme poverty fall. We've seen democracy spread. We've seen school enrollment go way up compared to what it was in the 1980s. Inequality has also fallen, although remains very high. But the two challenges that you cited in the context of productivity, informality and crime, or organized crime. Those two seem intractable.
Yeah, that's the tragedy because they have a lot of inertia. They don't change. Although we've made some progress in informality in some countries more than others. Uruguay is a good example of a country that has lowered informality from low levels to begin with. Brazil also has, introduced important changes, especially in the tax legislation that has helped the reduction of informality, but not in a significant way. Colombia as well. During my time as finance minister, we cut payroll taxes that helped reduce labor informality. But you can say that there is a success story on informality in Latin America. And on crime, I guess there was early progress in Colombia, a significant reduction in crime. This is in the last 2 decades, but that hasn't changed much, say, in the past 5 years. So Colombia is a success in terms of the reduction of crime, but from very, very high levels to levels that are still relatively higher than the average of Latin America. But if you look at Central America, you look at Mexico, if you look at Ecuador, even Peru, the problem is getting worse.
Mauricio, I would be negligent if I did not ask you a question specifically about Colombia. The IMF's latest forecasts for growth, these numbers that we've been talking about over the course of our conversation today, they see 1.4% growth for 2023, 2.0% growth for 2024. Where do you think the risk is on those numbers? Do you think it's more likely that Colombia could do a little better or a little worse given the current environment there?
I think it's perhaps the country in Latin America that I'm most worried about because I sense that the administration stopped listening to the more moderate views with so many announcements in terms of changes in regulation, in the electricity sector, in infrastructure, on the health sector, on pensions. The level of uncertainty is just too significant. And therefore, private investment is going to take a pause. And that's going to be costly in terms of economic growth.
After a break, Mauricio will explain why, despite all the challenges we've just discussed, he sees a historic opportunity for conditions to improve in Latin America. The America's Quarterly Podcast is sponsored in part by Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute. Since 1985, the Institute has been at the forefront of innovation in cybersecurity, national security, and public policy. You can dive into their vast library of Latin American security-focused research, explore their academic and professional programs, or tap into their open-source data initiatives. Learn more at go.fiu.edu/impact. Well, Mauricio, let's shift now to the more optimistic side of this, the glass half full, if you will. You mentioned that you think that there's a discussion to be had around opportunities for the region, especially in this global moment of conflict and war in Ukraine and Gaza, and the need for nearshoring as supply chains move from Asia back to the Western Hemisphere. Where do you see progress actually happening?
Well, with so many crises happening and kind of like overlapping and interacting and getting worse, as we are seeing in the latest events, Latin America has one important characteristic. And this is interesting because we talked about crime. And yes, that is a huge problem in Latin America. But at the other end, Latin America, from an international perspective, is a peaceful region. It's a region that does not challenge other countries. That peaceful aspect is very important because it's a reliable partner. It's a reliable supplier. And that means that the world wants to relate with Latin America. And this is true of the US. This is true of China. This is true of Europe. Everyone wants to have a good relationship with Latin America. And that's something that we should turn to our advantage.
Let me just ask you, how important is the region's relative neutrality on this question of U.S. versus China, and even now with postures on the war in the Middle East? How important is the region's neutrality to maintaining that status of being a safe place to invest?
Neutral in the sense that the region wants to have kind of like a working relationship with all the powers in the world. Mexico is benefiting as no one else in the world from the new kind of like reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring approach of the US, however you want to call it. It's amazing what Mexico is doing in terms of export growth, becoming now the number one supplier of imports in the United States, above China, which is just in itself remarkable. The southern kind of like part of the continent, South America, but more to the south, say from Peru to the south, including Brazil, very dynamic trade with China, growing relationship with China, also quite strategic relationship in terms of the supply of critical minerals, not just to China, but to the world at large. And finally, the European Union. There was a meeting of heads of government in Brussels by the middle of this year. Then finance ministers from Latin America and Europe got together about a month ago in Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And the main message is Europe wants to have a stronger partnership with Latin America because of a number of things, including the supply of critical minerals, but also Latin America being an important market for electric vehicles or for electrolyzers that are necessary for the production of hydrogen, or the fact that Europe also believes very seriously in the importance of protecting our biodiversity. I mean, there are a number of issues. So Latin America is in a good spot in terms of being attracted by these geopolitical powers, and they all wanting to, in one way or another, engage more deeply with our region.
Another reason for optimism that we cite in our article, Mauricio, is the energy transition and Latin America's central role in that as a supplier of some of the minerals and materials that are needed. I know, however, that is a mixed story. It remains a story that is still largely about potential rather than execution. You're an expert on this. You study this at Columbia. What can you tell us about where we stand right now on this issue?
Well, this is a whole topic in itself, but I would just highlight 3 points here. Point number one is that renewable energy is nothing new to Latin America. I mean, this is what Latin America has been doing for decades. So on average, the electricity generated in Latin America comes from renewable sources, like 50%. And in some countries, more than 70%. In some countries, actually 100%, like Paraguay. So this is an advantage that the region has. The critical minerals are basically one of the strengths that Latin America has because, again, it could be a reliable, predictable, trustworthy supplier. And the critical minerals are necessary for everything that the world wants to do in terms of the energy transition, from the production of batteries to solar panels to electrical vehicles. I mean, they all require critical minerals. And finally, I would add that this is a region that is very ambitious also in terms of the reduction in emissions. Maybe, and this is one of the reasons, the possible reasons, is that this is a region that is very exposed, very vulnerable to climate change, and we are seeing that. But that has generated a sentiment on the part of the electorate. Voters actually support platforms that are green, that fight emissions. So politically, in Latin America, it's an asset to be on the side of the climate transition, of basically promoting, for example, the electrification of public transportation. And that's why you see that mayors in many of our cities are promoting that agenda. Bogota and Santiago de Chile have the largest fleets of electrical buses outside China in the world. And that just basically reflects the sentiment of voters and the electorate. And I think that's another important asset. We still have a lot of work to do to make sure that we take advantage of these kind of like huge assets for the energy transition and transform that and convert that into economic growth, something that has not happened yet.
Well, let me ask a provocative question based on what you were just talking about with regards to climate. There are people around the world in the region. I have heard some people in President Petro's government also express this view over the years that growth is essentially harmful in today's world, and that we shouldn't be pursuing it anymore because it's bad for the globe, bad for climate, and so on. What's your response to that?
I'm optimistic in that sense, in that the world can actually continue to improve living standards. And I'm talking here about the world, not just about Latin America, living standards, our quality of life. And at the same time, achieve the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions so that these two things are compatible and consistent. And that it's not going to require a dramatic loss in our standards of life. We're just going to do things differently. And we're going to do things better. And we're going to do things actually in a way that will generate opportunities for economic growth. But yes, there are the pessimists too. And the pessimists think that the only way that we can survive as a species is by lowering our living standards. And that's the degrowth camp. The degrowth camp is a niche in the academic kind of like environment, and it's a niche that is very much centered in Europe and in some parts of Europe. But one thing is for them to have that view, and a very different thing is for a government in Latin America to advocate for that. Because a government in Latin America has to be advocating for economic growth, because that's the only way in which we're going to reduce poverty, we're going to improve our living standards, we're going to expand the middle class. So where I think the big mistake was made on the part of those members of the Petro government was in trying to apply theories that are not mainstream in Europe and think of them as a guiding principle for policies in Latin America. That's a big mistake.
Let me ask you, Mauricio, about a recent statement you made. You said that the new wave of governments in the region, including those on the left, they're not necessarily populist. They're something else. And I believe statist was the word you used. What's the difference?
Many people refer to the current kind of like wave or cohort of presidents in Latin America as the new populists. And what we're seeing in the region is not necessarily populism, or at least not populism in the sense it is known in Europe today, and not in the sense that it was kind of like the typical approach in Latin America 20, 30, 40 years ago, where populists were basically irresponsible governments that didn't care about increasing government expenditures and paying for that with newly printed money, causing inflation, causing huge deficits, and of course, causing crisis. So this is a new kind of like generation of leaders. So who are these new leaders? So these new leaders are essentially a combination of forces, but we need to kind of like understand what's their main trait. And I think, to go to your point, the main common thread in this new generation of, let's say, leftist leaders, not necessarily all of them on the left, is the revival of the state at the center of the decision making, the center of the economy, the state as the driving force, the state as the ultimate solution to all the economic and social problems of the region. So it's the revival of the state. I think that's what describes people like López Obrador, Boric, Lula, Petro better. Of course, Maduro, Arce in Bolivia have been, under this view and have been promoting this for decades now. So this is relatively newer for the other countries that I just mentioned.
Well, and it's interesting because it's not just in Latin America. In fact, you could firmly place Joe Biden in this group as well, influenced by people like the Italian economist Mariana Mazzucato, basically this I say new idea. I mean, in some ways, it's a very old idea that the state should be, directing at least some parts of the economy, industrial policy, strategic industries, and so on. I mean, have you wondered if, as you see this sweeping the globe once again, have you wondered if maybe this is a time for that, given some of the changes that we see in the global economy, given the stagnant living standards in places like the United States over the last 30 years. I mean, what do you feel like this current's effects will be in the region?
What worries me is that the state in Latin America is in no capacity to undertake all those responsibilities. Tax revenues over GDP are relatively low. It's a state also with relatively low legal capacity in the sense of imposing the rule of law. We just discussed that when we talked about crime. So, what happens when weak states are given these huge powers and where you expect a lot to be delivered? I think ultimately the economies suffer. It's not just about the empowerment of the state, it's also about decisions that undermine the role of the private sector. And I'd say that in Latin America, if the private sector decides not to invest, the economies suffer quite a bit. And this is not just about foreign investment, this is also about domestic investment. So my concern is that it takes a long time to strengthen the state, to put the state in the conditions that it can deliver what Mazzucato and others promote. And in the meantime, we lose the support of the private sector, and therefore we can weaken our economies.
So, looking at the region right now, Mauricio, kind of from the highest possible vantage point, where do you see the best opportunities?
Latin America is in the best of all possible worlds. And I think this is, in my life, I have not seen so many opportunities as I see now for improving economic growth and delivering better kind of like outcomes. For every global crisis that there is, Latin America has, I'd say the entire answer, but part of the answer, part of the solution. If there is a crisis in terms of energy, that there's not enough supply of energy, say fossil fuels, well, Brazil, Argentina, Guyana are increasing their oil production and are becoming important suppliers, trustworthy suppliers. Food, Latin America has the land, has the water, and has the capacity to increase food production in very significant ways. It will require also to improve the production and increase the production of fertilizer. That's a weak spot in the region. In terms of friendshoring, well, it's not just Mexico. Many other countries in the region have free trade agreements with the United States, can be important suppliers of products to the US, including products that have inputs from China, by the way, which is something that Mexico is doing. Think of the energy transition, clean energies. So, it goes without saying that this is a region that has huge potential, not just to generate clean energy, but to transform that clean energy into products for the world market, products with a low carbon footprint. And last but not least, this is a region that, has made significant progress in the last 20 years. We should not ignore that, resulting in an expansion of the middle class. And therefore is a region where, with the adequate numbers of economic growth, markets, consumption is going to increase, becoming an important buyer of products from all over the world. So I guess this is a region that has huge opportunities in a number of areas, the critical areas where the world needs solutions and needs answers in the decades ahead. So that's the optimism I have. And we can seize that moment and take advantage of these opportunities if we put the right policies. But the right policies are essentially long-term policies, including the private sector, not the policies of divisiveness that we're seeing in some countries.
Do you see anybody in the region, any government that has gotten that mix somewhat right? I mean, I think of the recent governments in Uruguay as one example. I know that's a small country and people roll their eyes sometimes, but it is, as we pointed out in America's Quarterly earlier this year, a country that 20 years ago really seemed lost. And so, therefore, proof that it is possible for a country to substantially improve in a relatively short period of time. Do you see anybody else out there who's at least doing okay on this front?
I don't think we have a role model in the region that we can say this is what we need to emulate and this is what we need to do. we need to go back to the politics of moderation or centrism or pragmatism to be able to do this. I think Brazil still has an opportunity to take advantage of this. I mean, it's in a unique position, not just because of its size. It's also the fact that it's going to be leading the G20. So it could use that to its advantage.
Well, and I would note this relatively moderate turn that the Lula government has taken, which you point out, but also we just had a center-right candidate win in Ecuador. Voters there chose a relatively center-ish candidate. And we saw a similar phenomenon in Guatemala, where things are complicated, but the winner there, Bernardo Arevalo, is very much a center-left type of figure. So maybe that does indicate something new and perhaps a little bit more centrist in the air.
The latest data points are all favorable, and that's interesting.
Thank you for this conversation. I think we've covered a lot of ground, some reasons to be hopeful, some areas for improvement. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the podcast.
All right, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Always good talking to you as well.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.